My name is Madison Robinson. I am 27 years old. For as long as I can remember, my parents labeled me the family disappointment, while my sister Paige was treated like royalty collecting Ivy League acceptances and promises of a $1 billion inheritance. They ridiculed my struggle with information processing at dinner tables, barred me from every significant family decision, and paid me a pathetic salary for my work at their company while showering Paige in luxury. But on the night of Paige's graduation at a prestigious Seattle venue, in the presence of 50 of the city's most influential figures, a man I had never met approached my table. He handed me a heavy, wax-sealed envelope that contained the power to dismantle every lie my parents had built their reputation upon. What they did not know was that my late great-aunt Beatrice had been observing their cruelty from afar. She witnessed how they cast me aside, and she left me a secret that would force the entire Robinson tech hierarchy to its knees. The Robinsons were Seattle royalty, the kind of family whose name occupied stadium plaques and university donor boards. My father, David, functioned as the CEO of Robinson Tech, a software empire my great-aunt Beatrice had essentially nurtured from a garage startup in the late 90s. By this year, the firm held a valuation of nearly $1 billion. I was born with a processing disability that made rapid-fire administrative tasks look like a blur of static, yet my father viewed my brain as a malfunctioning piece of hardware. When I was a teenager, they funded Paige's elite summer programs in Europe and private coaches, but when I requested assistance for my learning difference, my mother Susan merely looked through me. "Madison," she said, "we have already invested so much into your potential. At some point, you must accept that you are simply not wired for the corporate world." I was 16, and for a decade I believed that cold, calculated dismissal. I am sharing this because if you have ever been the person the world underestimated, the one discarded by the very people tasked with protecting you, I want to know you are not alone. Please drop a comment with your age and let me know where you are watching from so I can see who is standing with me. Welcome to Elderly Stories. Now let me tell you what happened when the board doors finally swung open. The ballroom of the Grand Hyatt in Seattle radiated an artificial warmth that felt suffocating under the weight of my father's gaze. I sat at table 27, a spot strategically positioned near the service entrance, hidden from the primary view of the stage where my parents stood in the spotlight. Paige was the center of their universe, glowing in a dress that likely cost more than my annual rent. Her smile practiced and perfect as she accepted the accolades of the evening. They announced her as the future of Robinson Tech, the golden child who would inherit the legacy. I felt the familiar sting of invisibility that had defined my life since I was a small child. I looked down at my hands resting on a napkin that felt rough against my skin, and the memory of a rainy Tuesday morning in our old family house suddenly flooded my mind. I was 7, sitting at the kitchen table staring at a page of math problems that looked like a swarm of insects moving across the paper. The words would not stay still, and the numbers defied my attempt to sequence them. My teacher had called my parents to voice concerns about my progress, describing my struggle as a significant processing hurdle. Instead of patience, I found my mother pacing the kitchen, her voice sharp with an irritation that cut deeper than any scolding. "Why is this so hard for you?" she had demanded, tapping her manicured nail against the wood until the sound grated against my nerves. She did not want to understand the way my brain worked. She only wanted a daughter who looked good on paper. Paige, who was 2 years younger, sat on the counter swinging her legs, watching me with a smug, knowing look. It was the beginning of my role as the disposable asset. While I spent my afternoons crying over worksheets with a tutor who grew increasingly impatient because I did not absorb information at the pace of an average student, Paige was enrolled in elite violin lessons and private French immersion camps. My father would come home, toss his briefcase onto the counter, and ask Paige to play a piece she had been practicing. He would beam as she performed, never once glancing at the stack of failed assessments I had tucked away in my backpack. I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be nurtured. When I turned 16, the disparity became even more pronounced. My father began inviting local investors to our home for dinner parties, and I was expected to serve the appetizers while standing in the background. I could hear them discussing the latest software developments, the nuances of machine learning, and the way the market was shifting in favor of cloud infrastructure. I understood more than they gave me credit for, but I had been conditioned to remain silent. One evening, I tried to offer an insight regarding a project my father was discussing, my voice hesitant but clear. The table went silent, and my father looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance that I have never forgotten. "Madison," he said, his tone dripping with forced kindness, "please, focus on clearing the plates. We prefer to keep the grown-up business discussions to the people who are actually running the company." I was 15 at the time, and I felt as though I had been slapped. My mother added a patronizing smile that felt like ice. "Leave the strategy to Paige," she suggested, even though Paige was currently distracted by her phone. It was clear that my input was not just unwanted, it was considered a disruption to their curated environment. As I moved into my early 20s, the cycle of dismissal continued. I finished university not at the school I had originally hoped for, but at a state institution that my parents considered a concession to my academic shortcomings. When I graduated, my father offered me a position at Robinson Tech, not as a creative contributor, but as a low-level data clerk in a windowless office in the basement of our downtown headquarters. My job consisted of verifying input errors for the logistics team, a task so monotonous it felt designed to stifle any ambition I might have harbored. I sat in that cubicle for 2 years, listening to the hum of the cooling fans, watching my colleagues move up the ladder while I remained static. Every morning, I watched Paige walk through the lobby, escorted by high-level executives who wanted to impress the heir apparent. She was given a corner office with a view of the Seattle skyline before she even fully understood how to read a quarterly report. I was the one who corrected the typos in the board presentations, the one who organized the files for the legal department, and the one whose name was never mentioned when a success was celebrated. I was the ghost in the machine, the girl who did the work that kept the empire running without ever receiving a shred of acknowledgement. The humiliation at the graduation party was merely the latest chapter in a long history of being treated as an inconvenience. As I looked up at the stage again, I saw my father lean over to whisper something in Paige's ear, his hand firm on her shoulder. They were so busy projecting the image of a perfect dynasty that they failed to notice I had stopped reacting to their cruelty in the way they expected. I was no longer the girl who cried in the kitchen or the clerk who kept her head down in the basement. The years of being discarded had taught me to observe everything, to document every inconsistency, and to find the patterns in the architecture of their lives. I realized then that my struggle with processing had forced me to develop a different kind of vision, one that saw the structural flaws in their business that everyone else was too distracted by the surface glitter to notice. I saw the ways they bypassed accounting standards, the ways they prioritized Paige's image over the stability of the long-term tech assets, and the ways they assumed I would never possess the intellect to grasp the magnitude of their actions. They thought I was the slow one, the daughter who could not keep pace with the world, but they were the ones who were blind. They believed their control was absolute because they owned the titles and the assets, but they underestimated the power of the person who handled their data. I knew exactly where the cracks were in the foundation of Robinson Tech, and I knew exactly when those cracks would become impossible to ignore. As a new executive approached our table to shake hands with my mother, I noticed the way she gripped her wine glass, her knuckles whitening as she maintained her composure. A flash of panic crossed her face when she realized the investor was asking about a project I had recently finalized. I spoke up, my voice steady, providing the technical data he needed to feel confident in the venture. My father glared at me, his eyes warning me to retreat, but the investor was already nodding clearly, impressed by the clarity of my answer. The interaction ended, and my mother leaned into me, her voice a dangerous whisper. "Stop trying to act like you belong here," she hissed, her eyes cold. "You are here to keep a low profile and not draw attention to your sister's success." I turned my head to look at her, maintaining a calm, that seemed to unsettle her. I simply provided the facts. I responded, my pulse not even spiking. Why does a fact make you so uncomfortable? Before she could answer, the lights in the room dimmed significantly as a man in a gray suit began navigating the crowded floor toward our vicinity. He did not look at anyone else. His eyes fixed on me with a focused intensity that set off an alarm in my chest. He was carrying a slim, heavy leather case. My father was still laughing at a joke made by an associate, unaware that the dynamic of his world was about to shift permanently. I felt a sudden urge to stand up to leave the room and to escape the impending collision of my past and my future. But I knew that if I left, I would never get the clarity I had spent 27 years waiting for. I remained in my chair watching the man approach, wondering what secrets were hidden in that briefcase. My father's laughter died out as he spotted the man, his brow furrowing as he attempted to identify the interloper. The man ignored my father completely, walking straight to my side of the table and extending a hand to me. My mother's grip on her glass tightened until I thought the stem might snap, her eyes darting between me and the stranger. This is the beginning, I thought, and for the first time in my life I felt truly ready for whatever was coming next. I looked at the man, the envelope in his pocket clearly visible, and I took a slow, deep breath. The stage light hit my father again, his mouth opening to deliver another speech about the greatness of the Robinson legacy, unaware that the person who held the key to that legacy was sitting just a few feet away, watching his entire kingdom begin to tilt. My mother opened her mouth to say something, perhaps to order me to hide or to be quiet, but the words died in her throat as the stranger stood before us, blocking the view of the ballroom. I was no longer the invisible daughter, I was the focus of the night. The stranger in the gray suit bowed slightly, a gesture so precise it seemed out of place in the chaotic atmosphere of the ballroom. He did not introduce himself to my father or acknowledge the bewildered stares of the surrounding guests. Instead, he maintained his focus entirely on me, his presence acting as a grounding force against the rising tide of parental disapproval. My father stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and righteous indignation. "Who are you, and why are you interrupting my daughter's celebration?" he demanded, his voice projecting the practiced authority of a man who usually commanded instant compliance. The man did not flinch, nor did he raise his voice to match my father's volume. "My name is Julian Thorne," he replied, his tone as cool as the Seattle rain. "I represent the estate of the late Beatrice Robinson. I have instructions that necessitate a brief moment of your time, but only if Madison is present." The mere mention of Aunt Beatrice caused the air around my mother to shift. She went uncharacteristically still, her gaze narrowing as she searched for a reason to dismiss this unexpected encounter. "Beatrice has been gone for 3 years," my mother noted, her voice brittle. "Whatever business you think you have with our family was settled when the probate court closed her files." Julian simply reached into his jacket, producing a slim, leather-bound notebook that looked remarkably like the ones I used to see on my aunt's desk every Sunday afternoon. "The probate court closed the files they were aware of," Julian corrected softly. "There is a distinction between what a family chooses to disclose and what a founder chooses to protect." He glanced at me, and for a fleeting second, his expression softened into something resembling genuine respect. "I am here to deliver the final component of Beatrice's legacy," he stated, "and the clock is already ticking." My father scoffed, dismissing the comment with a wave of his hand. "This is some kind of stunt," he muttered, looking toward the security detail positioned near the entrance. "I want you off these premises immediately before I have you removed for trespassing." I did not move. I did not look at my father. I watched Julian. The memory of those long, quiet Sundays at Aunt Beatrice's estate pulling me back in time. I remembered the scent of old paper leather bindings and cedar wood that permeated her sunroom. Beatrice had been the black sheep of the Robinson family, a woman who had built a reputation for being difficult because she refused to play the sycophant to her own brother, my grandfather. While my parents saw her as a bitter, aging recluse, I saw the only person who had ever taken the time to listen to the way my mind actually functioned. I would sit across from her at a heavy mahogany table while she spread out complex legal contracts and engineering blueprints. She never once told me that my inability to read a page of text in a traditional rapid-fire way was a deficit. Instead, she asked me to look at the documents as if they were a series of interconnected physical structures. Look at the flow of the capital, she would tell me, tracing a line through a merger agreement with her fountain pen. The words are just noise, Madison, but the architecture of the deal is where the truth lives. You do not need to be a speed reader to see where the support beams are missing. Over those years, she taught me that my struggle to process linear text was actually an advantage in disguise. I learned to identify patterns, to spot the anomalies in financial statements, and to map out the potential points of failure in a business venture before the executives even knew they were in trouble. She showed me how to read the world in 3 dimensions, seeing the relationships between parties, the underlying motivations of the shareholders, and the potential for long-term growth or collapse. She was not just my aunt, she was the architect of my self-worth. She taught me that being the slow one was simply a way of saying I was being thorough, and that thoroughness was a quality most of these corporate giants completely lacked. As I sat in the ballroom, the weight of those lessons suddenly became my anchor. I knew exactly why Beatrice had kept Julian Thorne in the shadows for so long. She had been playing a long game, waiting for the moment when my parents would finally reveal the full scope of their entitlement. They had assumed I would never find my footing in the industry they controlled, but they had forgotten that Beatrice had given me the blueprints to their entire operation. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and looked my father directly in the eye. "Let him speak. Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the party. "If you are as confident in your leadership as you claim to be, then you have nothing to fear from a lawyer." My father's jaw tightened, his ego struggling to reconcile his desire to remain the alpha in the room with the potential for public scandal. He shot a look at Paige, who was currently watching the scene with a mix of boredom and irritation, clearly wishing the drama would end so she could go back to being the center of attention. I turned back to Julian and nodded. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here," I invited him. Julian opened the notebook and pulled out a single cream-colored document that appeared to be a legal codicil to a will. This document was notarized the week before Beatrice passed away. Julian explained, his voice projecting just enough so that the surrounding guests could hear. "It dictates the ownership of the majority shares of Robinson Tech and outlines the conditions for their activation." My mother let out a small, sharp gasp, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "Ownership of the majority shares was tied up in a trust that you were supposed to manage," she challenged, looking at my father with sudden, sharp suspicion. "David, what is she talking about?" My father looked at Julian, his mask of corporate composure starting to crack at the edges. "That trust is irrevocable," he growled, his voice losing its polish. "It was assigned to my management for the sake of market stability." "That is not entirely accurate," Julian countered, his eyes flickering toward me. "The trust was designed to prevent a hostile takeover, but Beatrice included a clause that allowed for the redistribution of voting power if the current leadership demonstrated a failure to adhere to the fiduciary guidelines set forth by the company's original charter. She called it the safety valve." My father's face drained of color as the implications of Julian's words settled over him like a shroud. A safety valve. I remembered the term perfectly. Beatrice had spoken about it once while we were reviewing a particularly predatory contract my father had attempted to push through the board. She had told me that every system needed a way to release the pressure before the entire thing exploded. She had laughed to sound like dry leaves and said that if she ever felt the greed in the room becoming too overwhelming, she would know exactly which lever to pull. I realized then that my father had likely been abusing the company's internal accounts for years, perhaps even skimming off the top to fund Paige's lifestyle or his own vanity projects, all while assuming that I was too detached from the core operations to ever notice. He had played a dangerous game, believing that the daughter he mocked was the only one who didn't understand the rules. But he had been wrong. I didn't just understand the rules, I knew how to rewrite them. Julian stepped closer and handed me the document. "These are your instructions, Madison," he said. "You are the only person empowered to initiate the audit." My father reached out to snatch the paper, his instinct to suppress the truth overriding his sense of social decorum. "Get your hands off that," he barked, his voice raw. "That is company property." I pulled the document back, keeping it well out of his reach. "It is my property," I replied, a cold sensation of power washing over me. "And as of tonight, I am the one who decides what happens next." The tension in the room had become physical, an invisible wall separating us from the rest of the party. The guests were beginning to notice the shift in the atmosphere, and the murmurs were growing into a chorus of curiosity. Paige finally stepped off the stage, her smile replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "What is happening?" she demanded, looking to our parents. "Dad, why are you letting her cause a scene at my party?" My father did not answer. His eyes locked onto the document in my hands. He was calculating his options, looking for a way to discredit Julian or to label the codicil as a forgery. But he knew as well as I did that Julian Thorne did not make mistakes, and he certainly did not show up at high-profile events with fraudulent paperwork. Julian turned back to me and offered a small, knowing nod. "There is an emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday morning," he informed me. "Your presence is required to confirm the transfer of authority." I felt a surge of exhilaration, but I kept my face neutral, a mask of professionalism that Beatrice would have been proud of. "I will be there," I promised, "and I suggest you ensure the boardroom is ready for a complete restructuring." My mother made a final attempt to salvage the situation, her voice shifting into a pathetic, pleading tone. "Madison, sweetheart, let's go into the office and discuss this like a family. You don't want to do this to us. You don't want to be the reason this company fails." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized that she was not worried about the company at all. She was worried about her lifestyle, her influence, and her standing in the community. She had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, and now when the worth of the company was hanging in the balance, she was trying to use that same manipulation to protect her own interests. "I will not go into the office with you," I said, my voice clear and final. "I will meet you in the boardroom on Monday. And you should know, Mother, that I am not here to fail. I am here to build something that actually deserves to survive." My father turned and began to walk away, his posture stiff, clearly intending to make a phone call to his legal team or his private security. But I wasn't finished. I wasn't going to let him retreat into his office and spend the next 48 hours finding a way to destroy me. I looked at Julian and signaled for him to wait. "I have one more thing to say before the board meeting," I announced, and every eye in the room turned toward me. "I am looking into the offshore accounts that have been linked to the tech development team for the past 5 years. I suggest that anyone who has been involved in those transfers starts looking for their own legal counsel." The silence that followed was so profound that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I had thrown the grenade, and now I was going to watch the debris land. My father stopped dead in his tracks, his back to me, the color draining from his face even further. He did not turn around. He just walked toward the exit, his composure entirely gone. The party was over, and the war for Robinson Tech had just begun. The morning light filtered through the blinds of my small apartment, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. My phone vibrated against the bedside table, a relentless hum that signaled the arrival of the inevitable. I had spent the last 24 hours reliving the moment at the ballroom, dissecting the look of sheer terror on my father's face when I mentioned the offshore accounts. The quiet of my home felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating opulence of the Hyatt, but I knew the peace was merely an illusion. I had challenged a man who viewed his family as a business asset, and he was not the type to accept a hostile takeover from his own daughter. My screen displayed a message from the HR portal of Robinson Tech. It was a formal notification of a mandatory meeting with the executive board scheduled for 9 o'clock. I dressed with purpose, selecting a suit that was understated but sharp, a reminder that I was no longer the girl who served appetizers in the background. My reflection in the mirror showed someone who had moved beyond the need for their validation, a woman who finally owned her own narrative. I drove to the downtown headquarters, the same building where I had spent years in the basement office, and walked through the lobby with a stride that forced the security guards to take notice. The air inside the office felt thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and high-stakes anxiety. I ascended the elevator to the executive floor, the doors sliding open to reveal a hallway filled with senior managers who stared at me with varying degrees of confusion and caution. They had heard the rumors of the ballroom confrontation, and the grapevine had already transformed the story into a legend. I reached the double doors of the boardroom and did not hesitate. Inside, my father stood at the head of the long, polished walnut table, his hands pressed flat against the wood. My mother sat to his right, her expression a masterclass in controlled hostility. Paige was absent, presumably still nursing her ego, but the rest of the board was present, their eyes darting between me and my father like spectators at a gladiator match. "Sit down, Madison," my father barked, his voice lacking the usual cadence of confidence. He looked as though he had not slept, his tie slightly crooked, a detail that revealed his instability. I pulled out a chair and sat, keeping my hands folded on the table. "We have a brief agenda," my father continued, gesturing to a stack of papers in front of him. "Given the recent disruptions to the internal operations of the company, the board has concluded that a transition in personnel is necessary to maintain the integrity of our workflow." He pushed a folder toward me. "We are terminating your contract effective immediately. Your performance over the last 2 years has failed to meet the standards required for this firm." The words hung in the air, heavy and artificial. It was a transparent play, a desperate move to strip me of my status before I could officially present Beatrice's codicil to the board. My mother offered a thin, pitying smile. "It is for your own good, Madison," she chimed in, her tone dripping with fake concern. "You have always struggled to keep up with the technical demands of this department. We believe it is time you find a career path that is more suited to your natural limitations." I let a slow, deliberate smile form on my lips. "My performance," I repeated, looking around the table at the faces of men and women who had spent years ignoring my contributions. "My performance has been the backbone of the logistics audit for the past 3 years. Are you suggesting that the quarterly reports were filled with inaccuracies?" My father did not blink. "I am suggesting that you are unqualified to continue representing this company," he declared. "The board has voted to remove you from all duties." I reached into my bag and pulled out a digital tablet, tapping the screen to display a summary of the data I had been managing. "I have saved every email, every correction request, and every internal audit I completed for the department," I said, my voice steady. "If you want to argue about my qualifications, we can present the history of my work to the shareholders." My mother's eyes widened, a brief flicker of panic appearing before she forced it away. "You are being hysterical," she snapped. "The board has made its decision. We are not interested in your personal grievances." I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto the chairperson of the board, a man named Arthur Hayes, who had been a loyal friend to my father for decades. "Mr. Hayes," I said, addressing him directly, "are you aware that the logistics department has been operating with a 5% margin error that my father requested I ignore?" The silence in the room became sharp enough to cut through. My father's grip on the table tightened, the veins in his hands standing out against his skin. "That is a baseless accusation," he shouted, his face turning a dark, blotchy red. "You are clearly unwell, and you are trying to drag this company into the mud because you are bitter about your failure." I knew this was coming. I knew they would attempt to paint me as the unstable child, the one who couldn't handle the pressure of the corporate world. It was their classic defense. But I had prepared for this moment, not just with documents, but with the knowledge of how they operated. "I am not bitter," I replied calmly. I am simply clarifying the state of the firm before we move on to the next item of business. My mother stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. We are finished here, she announced, pointing toward the door. Leave the building, Madison. If you do not comply, I will call security and have you escorted from the premises. It was the ultimate power move, the final attempt to silence the person who knew too much. They thought they could purge me from the records, delete my credentials, and cast me into the street, and that I would simply vanish because I was the slow one. They were still trapped in the past. They didn't realize that their attempt to fire me was the exact catalyst I needed to trigger the emergency audit. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, and looked at the faces around the table one last time. You are trying to cut the branch you are sitting on, I told them, my voice devoid of any emotion. You think that by firing me you are securing your future, but you have only ensured that the investigation will be external rather than internal. My father laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Go ahead and complain, he said, turning his back on me. No one will listen to a fired clerk. I walked toward the door, my heart beating with the rhythm of a victory that they could not yet perceive. I had walked into this office an employee, and I was walking out a wild card. As I exited the boardroom, I noticed the secretary's desk was vacant, a clear sign that my access to the company's internal servers had already been revoked. They had moved quickly with a ruthless efficiency that only deepened my resolve. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button, feeling the weight of the codicil in my pocket. It was time to contact Julian Thorne again. The board meeting was a farce, a play they had scripted in a desperate attempt to maintain control. But they had forgotten the most important part of the business, the data. And I had the data. As I stepped out into the bright Seattle afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unrecognized number, but I had a strong suspicion of who was calling. I answered it, my pulse quickening. Ms. Robinson, a voice said, low and precise. This is the Federal Oversight Office. We have received your preliminary documentation. I smiled, the warmth of the sun feeling like a welcome embrace. I am ready to provide the rest, I answered. The war had escalated, and I was the one holding the high ground. My father might think he had fired me, but he had actually just released me from the constraints of his hierarchy. I was free, and I was dangerous. As I walked down the street, I saw a black sedan parked near the curb, its tinted windows offering no clue as to who was inside. I felt a chill run down my spine, a reminder that the stakes had shifted from corporate politics to something far more severe. They were watching me, but I didn't care. I had Beatrice's legacy, I had my own resilience, and I had a truth that was about to bring the entire Robinson empire to its knees. I started my car and pulled away from the curb, heading toward a meeting that would define the rest of my life. The conflict wasn't just about my position anymore. It was about the survival of the vision that had been entrusted to me. And I was going to see it through to the end, no matter what it cost. The afternoon air in Seattle carried a crisp, metallic tang that seemed to mirror the sharpened state of my own mind as I navigated the traffic toward the downtown core. My departure from the headquarters of Robinson Tech had been abrupt, yet the transition from employee to an adversary felt surprisingly natural. The sedan that had been parked outside the lobby remained in my rearview mirror for several blocks, a silent observer in the complex dance of corporate retribution. I kept my eyes on the road, my grip firm on the steering wheel, while the weight of the codicil in my bag served as a constant reminder of the leverage I now possessed. It was not merely about reclaiming a stolen inheritance. It was about exposing the rot that had taken root at the center of my family's empire. I reached the quiet, understated office of Thorne & Associates, a firm that specialized in the kind of complex estate litigation that most lawyers avoided for fear of offending the powerful. Julian Thorne greeted me in the lobby, his expression as unreadable as it had been the night of the party. He led me into a private conference room that overlooked the gray, churning waters of the Puget Sound, the silence of the space a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the boardroom. We have reached the next phase, Julian said, placing the heavy leather case on the table. You have successfully triggered the inquiry, and your father is already scrambling to secure his legal defenses. He is looking for a way to invalidate the document, but the notarization is ironclad. I took my seat and watched him open the case, revealing a thick stack of documents and a smaller, distinctively heavy box with a wax seal that shimmered in the low light. This is the item that Beatrice intended for you to receive only when the pressure reached a breaking point, Julian explained, pushing the box toward me. She was quite specific about the timing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull thudding sound that seemed to drown out the distant noise of the city. I lifted the box, the weight of it confirming that there was more inside than simple paper. I remembered the stories Beatrice used to tell about the early days of Robinson Tech, when it was nothing more than a shared vision and a few donated servers in a damp garage. She had built the foundation on a commitment to innovation, whereas my father had turned the company into a mechanism for extracting wealth to fuel his status. I broke the wax seal, the brittle red material cracking beneath my touch, and felt a strange sense of finality. Inside lay not only a key to a private vault, but a digital drive that carried a time-stamped history of every major financial decision my father had made since he took over the company. It was the absolute record of his betrayal. As I held the drive, the full reality of my situation finally sank in. I was not just challenging a CEO, I was deconstructing a lie that had lasted for over a decade. Julian watched me, his hands clasped neatly on the table. Your father is attempting to frame your dismissal as a result of incompetence. He continued, his voice dropping into a professional register. He has already begun reaching out to his contacts at the local newspapers to seed the narrative that you are a disgruntled former employee with a history of behavioral issues. They are trying to get ahead of the story before you go public. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I forced myself to breathe through it. They are operating from a place of fear, I noted, looking at the drive. They know that if the truth comes out, their reputation as titans of industry will be scorched earth. Julian nodded in agreement. That is why the next step must be executed with surgical precision. We need to file the injunction before the close of business tomorrow. If the board learns about the offshore accounts through the proper legal channels, your father will have no choice but to step down. Otherwise, he will find a way to bury the evidence and blame the discrepancies on a system error. I thought about the hours I had spent in that basement office, the endless cycles of verifying data that I now realized were being manipulated to mask the transfers. My father had relied on the assumption that I would never look past the spreadsheets, that I would be too intimidated by his authority to demand accountability. But the very thing he had labeled as my limitation, my need to map things out until I understood the entire structure, had become his downfall. I looked up at Julian, my resolve hardening. Let's do it, I said, my voice steady. We initiate the filing tomorrow morning. But I want it to be done in a way that forces them to respond in a public forum. If they want to destroy my reputation, I will give them the chance to do it under oath. Julian smiled, a thin and dangerous movement of his lips. That is the only way to ensure the board has to acknowledge the facts. He began to organize the papers, his speed and efficiency, a stark contrast to the frantic energy my mother had displayed in the boardroom. I stood up, feeling a strange lightness in my chest, as if the burden of being the invisible daughter had finally been shed. As I prepared to leave, Julian handed me a small embossed card. This is the contact for the forensic accountants. They are already waiting for the go-ahead. Once the injunction is filed, they will begin the sweep of the server logs. We are going to find every penny that was diverted. I took the card, tucking it carefully into my pocket. My phone chimed, a notification of an incoming email from the HR department at Robinson Tech. It was a formal termination letter, detailed and cold, filled with accusations of conduct that was detrimental to the company. My mother had been busy. They were already painting the target on my back, hoping to make me toxic to any future employer. I read the text, my face reflecting none of the emotion that was swirling within me. I was past the point of caring about their petty insults. I walked out of the office and into the elevator, the reflection in the polished steel showing me a woman who was no longer playing by their rules. The city skyline looked different from this perspective, less like a monolithic wall of power, and more like a collection of fragile structures, each one vulnerable to the right pressure. My father thought he was safe nestled behind his desk and his connections, but he had no idea what was coming. I reached my car and sat for a moment in the silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the traffic below. The next conflict was already taking shape in my mind, the inevitable confrontation with the board. They would try to dismiss me as a disgruntled daughter, a woman scorned, but they would have to contend with the documents I now carried. I pulled my phone out and drafted a message to my aunt's old network of colleagues, the ones who had remained loyal to the vision she had built. I needed to know who was still on my side, who could offer the support to ensure that the board didn't just side with my father out of habit. The game had moved from the ballroom to the courtroom, and the players were no longer just my family. They were the people whose livelihoods depended on the integrity of Robinson Tech. As I drove, I saw a familiar car tailing me again, a darker model this time keeping a precise distance. They were getting sloppy, they were panicking, and in their panic, they were making mistakes. I took a sudden turn down a side street, losing the car in the labyrinthine traffic of the district, my pulse racing with the thrill of the chase. I was no longer the one being hunted. I was the one setting the traps. I reached home and found a package waiting on my doorstep. It was a note from Paige, handwritten on heavy, cream-colored stationery. She didn't want to talk about business. She wanted to talk about our family, about how I was ruining our mother's life. She begged me to call her to meet her for a drink to settle this before it became a public spectacle. It was a classic trap. She wanted to record me, to catch me in an admission of revenge, to use it against me in court. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. She had never once asked me how I was doing in the 10 years I had worked for the company, and she certainly didn't care about my feelings now. Her only concern was the preservation of her status. I walked to the window and looked out at the lights of the city, thinking about the work ahead. I had to ensure that the audit was comprehensive, that no stone was left unturned. I was the architect of my own destiny, and I would not allow the Robinsons to dictate the outcome. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. I answered it, expecting a threat or a bribe. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a former engineer who had been pushed out by my father when he questioned the safety protocols of the new software rollout. He had been waiting for someone to finally open the vault. He told me there were other people who had been silenced by the very machine my father had built. The network of my allies was growing, and with every new connection, the structure of my father's empire grew more precarious. I wasn't just fighting for my own validation anymore. I was fighting for the people who had been crushed beneath the weight of his greed. I sat down at my desk and opened the digital drive, the blue light illuminating the room. It was time to start the real work. The drama was reaching a fever pitch, and I was exactly where I needed to be, at the heart of the storm, with the keys to the future in my hands. I wouldn't just tear the house down. I would rebuild it from the ground up, ensuring that the legacy of my aunt was finally realized. The final phase had begun, and there was no turning back. The weight of the digital drive felt like a physical burden against my chest as I sat in the dim light of my office. Yet it was the envelope from the ballroom that truly held the power to shift the earth beneath my parents' feet. I turned the thick cream-colored paper over in my hands, the wax seal broken, but the contents still pristine and sharp. I had tucked this envelope away in my clutch during the chaos of the graduation party, hiding it in the one place my mother would never think to look. Now, sitting alone in the silence of my apartment, I finally allowed myself the space to understand the magnitude of what Beatrice had entrusted to me. I had retreated to the privacy of the venue's bathroom that night, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, to steal a moment of clarity away from the prying eyes of the guests. I remembered the cold porcelain against my palms as I unfolded the document, my breath hitching as the legal terminology began to resolve into something concrete. Beatrice had not just left me a sentimental trinket or a small trust. She had bequeathed me 51% of the voting shares in Robinson Tech. The valuation current as of the latest market assessment placed my interest at $50 million. But the money was a secondary concern compared to the authority those shares commanded. The document was a masterpiece of legal engineering, a contingency plan that Beatrice had clearly drafted with the knowledge of my father's predilection for greed. It required an emergency board meeting to be convened within 72 hours of the disclosure, effectively stripping my father of his unilateral control the moment the paperwork was filed. As I studied the signature at the bottom of the page, I felt a wave of gratitude that made my vision blur. Beatrice had seen me not as the girl who struggled with standard academic metrics, but as the architect who could eventually rebuild her life's work. She had understood that my processing style was not a lack of intelligence, but a specific high-level way of perceiving structural complexity. I stood up and paced the room, the reality of the board meeting beginning to crystallize in my mind. This was the moment I had been subconsciously preparing for since those Sundays in the sunroom. My father had built his empire on the assumption that I was a permanent bystander, a person who could be kept in the basement, while he projected an image of success to the world. He had assumed that when he died the transition would be seamless, and that my mother would ensure I remained a silent, compliant shareholder. He had never counted on Beatrice's intervention. She had effectively bypassed him, installing me as the true successor, while he was still enjoying the illusion of being the sole king. My phone lit up with a message from Julian Thorne, confirming that the legal notice had been delivered to the board of directors. The countdown had begun. 72 hours. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I forced myself to sit back down and organize my thoughts. I knew my father would not simply sign away his kingdom. He would attempt to discredit the document, perhaps by claiming Beatrice was under duress, or that the legal language was flawed. I needed to be ready to counter every objection. I spent the next several hours mapping out the agenda for the meeting. I had to ensure that the transition of power was presented not as an act of family vengeance, but as a necessary correction to protect the company's stability. I drafted my opening remarks, focusing on the evidence of financial mismanagement and the necessity of bringing Robinson Tech back to its founding principles. I was going to be calm, decisive, and surgically precise. I was going to be the daughter he had never bothered to know. A sharp knock on my door jolted me back to the present. I walked over and checked the peephole. It was not Julian or a courier. It was Paige. Her presence at my apartment was entirely unexpected, as she had never once expressed interest in my living situation, and she certainly never visited without an invitation. I opened the door, and she stood there looking far less composed than she had at the party. Her designer coat was disheveled, and her makeup was smudged, a clear sign that the panic of the past 48 hours had taken its toll on her as well. "Madison," she said, her voice lacking its usual arrogance. "I need to talk to you." The tension in the hallway was palpable. The neighbors' doors shut tight against the intrusion of our family drama. I didn't invite her in, but she stepped into the entryway before I could stop her, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "You have no idea what you have triggered," she said, her tone trembling with an anger that didn't quite hide her underlying fear. "Dad is losing his mind. He is talking to his lawyers, to his partners, to anyone who will listen, trying to find a way to stop this meeting. You are going to ruin everything for us." I leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a sense of detachment. "Everything for us," I repeated, echoing her words. "You mean everything for you, Paige. You are worried about your lifestyle, your status, and your place in the company. You have never cared about the company as an entity. You only cared about the benefits of being the chosen one." Her face darkened. "That is not fair. I worked hard for my position. I earned my spot." I looked at her, remembering the private tutors, the summer internships, the open doors that had been handed to her while I was working in the dark. "You earned a spot, Paige, but you never learned how to lead. You are a puppet for Dad's ego, and you are terrified because for the first time in your life, you realize the person holding your strings is about to be cut loose. She gasped a sound of genuine shock, as if she had never considered herself anything other than a self-made success. You don't know the first thing about leadership, she spat, regaining some of her defensive posture. You think you can just walk in there with a piece of paper and take over. The board will laugh at you. They will see you for exactly what you are, a woman who has been bitter about her lack of success for years and is now trying to stage a coup. I allowed myself a small, sharp smile. If they want to laugh, let them. But they will have to laugh in front of a federal auditor. Paige's expression shifted, the anger receding to reveal a hollow, desperate fear. What does that mean? I didn't answer her. I didn't owe her the clarity of my plan. I walked back into the living room, leaving her standing in the entryway, a symbol of a life that was currently undergoing a profound structural failure. The conflict with Paige was a pebble in the larger mountain of my struggle, but it served as a clear indicator that the cracks in their foundation were widening. I knew that she had come here to see if she could intimidate me, to see if she could find a weakness she could exploit. She had failed, and in her failure she had confirmed that the desperation within their house was absolute. After she left, the apartment felt suddenly cavernous. I returned to my work, focusing on the finer details of the board meeting strategy. I was no longer afraid of the consequences of my actions. I had spent so much of my life shrinking to fit into the spaces they provided, believing that their version of my identity was the truth. But Beatrice had proven that the truth was much broader, much more intricate, and entirely within my grasp. I thought about the 51%. It was a majority, but it was also a responsibility. If I took control, I would be responsible for the livelihoods of thousands of employees, the future of the technology, and the reputation of the Robinson name. It was a heavy mantle, but it was one I had been training to wear since I was 7 years old, studying those blueprints and patterns under Beatrice's quiet guidance. I realized then that I had been building the architecture of this moment for a very long time. The final pieces were coming together, but I knew the next phase would be the most difficult. I had to survive the meeting. I had to face the board, the partners, and my own father in a setting where he would have every advantage in his favor. I was the outsider, the daughter who had been discarded, the clerk who had been fired. I would walk into that boardroom with only a document and my own resolve, and I would have to be perfect. As I looked out the window again, the city seemed to be waiting for the outcome. I had everything I needed, but the true test of my worth wasn't in the ownership of the company, it was in my ability to execute the change without becoming the very person I was working to replace. The cycle of greed had to end with me, or it would simply continue in a different form. I was the only one who could provide that, and I would not fail. My phone vibrated, another message from Julian. The meeting time had been confirmed. The stage was set. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug, a small comfort in the intensity of the night. I had 72 hours, and I knew exactly how I was going to use every second. I was not just going to take the chair, I was going to fundamentally transform what it meant to sit in it. The game had moved into the endgame, and for the first time, I was the one holding the board in my hands. The next conflict wasn't just coming. It was already here waiting for me to arrive. I looked at the calendar on the wall, the dates circled in red, and felt a quiet, powerful sense of anticipation. This was not a fight I had chosen, but it was one I was going to win. I closed my eyes, the image of the boardroom and the faces I would encounter there dancing behind my lids. I saw my father, my mother, and the entire architecture of the Robinson Empire, all of it held together by thin, brittle threads. I knew how to cut them, and I knew exactly how to make sure that when the house came down, I would be the one standing on firm ground, the architect of a new beginning. I took a final sip of coffee and turned back to my files, the work demanding my full attention, the silence of the room filled with the hum of a future I was finally ready to claim. The ticking of the wall clock in my apartment had become the soundtrack of my existence during those final 72 hours. Every second felt like a heavy stone added to a pile that was threatening to crush my resolve. I sat at my makeshift desk surrounded by the legal drafts that Julian had forwarded and the mental maps I had constructed during those long, transformative years with Beatrice. The internal conflict was a constant gnawing presence. I could easily choose the path of least resistance. I could take my modest savings move to a city where no one knew the Robinson name and start a quiet life as a consultant, leaving the empire to crumble under the weight of my father's greed. It was a tempting proposition. It promised safety, anonymity, and the end of the constant psychological warfare I had endured since childhood. Why fight for a company that had consistently treated me like a broken asset? Why subject myself to the inevitable public scrutiny and the vitriol my parents would spew in the press? The silence of my room often seemed to whisper that surrender was not weakness, but a form of liberation. Yet whenever the urge to abandon the struggle took hold, I would catch sight of the portrait of Beatrice that I had framed and hung near my workspace. Her eyes in the painting were sharp, knowing, and utterly defiant. I remembered the exact moment she had uttered the words that now fueled my every move. It was a humid afternoon, and we were looking at a set of blueprints for a commercial skyscraper that my father was attempting to force through the regulatory boards. I had been struggling to parse the dense text of the zoning requirements, the legalese making my vision dance with confusion. Beatrice had covered my hand with hers, her skin like parchment, and forced me to look away from the words and at the lines of the diagram. "Do not get lost in the prose, Madison," she had urged, her voice low and steady. "You read contracts like architecture because you see the structure others miss. Most people look at the ink and see rules, but you see the load-bearing walls and the points where the pressure will cause the roof to cave in. If you want to survive in this industry, stop trying to read it like everyone else. Start seeing the flaws in the design before the structure is even finished." That advice had been the key to everything. It transformed my perceived disability into my most formidable tool. My father and the board saw a girl who struggled with standard text, while I saw the underlying systemic failure of their entire enterprise. I realized that if I walked away, I was not just abandoning an inheritance. I was allowing a fundamentally broken structure to continue harming everyone it touched. The reality of my situation was stark. If I stayed silent, I would be effectively erasing the last decade of my own growth. I would be confirming their narrative that I was incompetent, that I was the slow one who couldn't handle the complexities of the Robinson tech world. But if I challenged them, I was facing a prospect that was terrifying in its own right. I would be challenging my own flesh and blood in an arena that had no room for sentiment. The internal struggle between the desire for a peaceful, invisible life and the moral imperative to hold the architects of my misery accountable grew more intense with every passing hour. I paced the floor, the cramped dimensions of my apartment, feeling like a pressure cooker. I remembered the feeling of being 12 years old, watching my mother meticulously prepare Paige for a piano recital while I was stuck in a corner with a stack of flashcards I couldn't process. I remembered the way my father would look right through me at dinner, discussing billion-dollar valuations as if I were a piece of the furniture. Those memories were not just ghosts, they were the structural evidence of a life built on neglect and arrogance. I sat down at the table and opened the final draft of the petition I had been working on with Julian. It was a masterfully crafted document designed to highlight the financial discrepancies I had uncovered during my tenure in the basement office. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a cold, hard, factual assault on the integrity of the firm's leadership. My father had relied on the fact that I was the girl they had labeled as the failure, the one who couldn't navigate the corporate ladder, and therefore the one who would never be able to produce a comprehensive audit. He had ignored the fact that the person in the basement was the one who saw the flow of every transaction, the one who handled the raw data before it was polished for the board's consumption. I had been the architect of his record-keeping, and I had left subtle, indelible markers in the system that he never suspected I was creating. I was not the slow one. I was the one who had been documenting the slow-motion car crash of his leadership. As the second day drew to a close, my phone buzzed with an alert from a news aggregator. A new piece had been published in a local business weekly about the upcoming transition at Robinson Tech. It contained a subtle, thinly veiled reference to a former employee who was attempting to cause instability in the market, an obvious attempt to preemptively paint me as a disgruntled actor. My parents were not just waiting for me to act. They were building a narrative to ensure that even if I made it to the boardroom, the board would be primed to view me with suspicion. The conflict had escalated from a family dispute to a public relations war. I knew then that staying silent would be catastrophic. The narrative they were building would eventually trap me, branding me as an incompetent, vindictive former employee, making it impossible to ever clear my name or take control of the legacy I was meant to hold. The choice was no longer just about the money, it was about the truth. I spent the final hours of the deadline refining the presentation materials. I had to ensure that the logic of my argument was bulletproof. I wasn't just bringing evidence of fraud. I was bringing a new vision for Robinson Tech, a structural shift that would rectify the imbalances my father had created. I needed to convince the board that my vision was not only superior to his, but that it was the only way to save the company from the legal and ethical ruin he had steered it toward. It was a daunting challenge, but Beatrice's voice echoed in my mind, steady and clear. "You see the structure others miss, Madison." I took a deep breath and looked at the clock. There were only 4 hours left before the window for the emergency board meeting request closed. I had to make the call. I had to inform Julian that we were moving forward regardless of the consequences. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice professional and calm. "Are you ready, Madison?" he asked. I took one final look around my apartment at the blueprints I had spread across the floor, at the digital drive that contained the end of my parents' control, and at the portrait of Beatrice. I was no longer the girl in the basement. I was the heir to a promise. "I am ready," I replied. The moment I hung up, the room seemed to go quiet, the frantic ticking of the clock losing its power over me. I had crossed the threshold from victim to protagonist. I knew that the moment I walked into that boardroom, I would be setting off a series of events that would change everything. There would be no going back to the invisibility of my old life, no retreating into the shadows of their expectations. I was stepping into the light, and I was going to carry the truth of my aunt's legacy with me. The final conflict of the 72 hours was not the filing of the documents, but the realization that I had fully outgrown the space they had constructed for me. I was not the Robinson daughter they had spent years trying to suppress. I was a fully formed individual with the capacity to reshape the future. The fear was still there, but it was now a tool, something to be measured and utilized, rather than something to be avoided. I gathered my things, placing the files into my leather portfolio with a steady, practiced hand. I felt the weight of the moment, the anticipation of the confrontation, and the absolute certainty that I was doing exactly what I was meant to do. I stepped out of the apartment and into the cool evening air, the lights of Seattle glowing in the distance. The next stage of the battle awaited, and I was finally truly in command of the design. The drive to Julian Thorne's office felt like a commute toward the most significant intersection of my life. The city lights of Seattle blurred into streaks of gold and crimson, echoing the frantic pace of the thoughts currently racing through my mind. I had cleared the hurdle of the 72-hour deadline, but the battle for Robinson Tech was only beginning. We had the evidence, the legal standing, and the motivation, but we lacked the final piece of the puzzle, a vote on the board of directors. Without a defector, my petition would be nothing more than a document of protest destined to be buried under the layers of corporate bureaucracy my father had perfected over the last 15 years. As I pulled into the parking structure of Julian's building, I felt the familiar weight of the challenge. I wasn't just fighting a company, I was dismantling a social order that had been built on the premise of my inferiority. When I reached the suite, Julian was already standing by the mahogany conference table. His files spread out in a precise geometric pattern that would have pleased Beatrice. He didn't waste time with formalities. "We have the internal audit, Madison," he said, his voice clipped and efficient. "But the current composition of the board is skewed in your father's favor. He has spent years cultivating their loyalty through stock options and personal favors. We need someone who is willing to break ranks, someone who can see that your father's mismanagement is a liability to the company's future." I nodded, walking over to the window to look out at the dark expanse of the skyline. I knew the board members individually. I had spent years watching them walk through the halls of our headquarters, hearing the way they spoke to my father, and noticing the way they avoided eye contact with me. Most of them were too comfortable with the status quo to risk their positions on a hunch. But there was one name that kept surfacing in my memory. A person who had been an integral part of the company long before my father had assumed total control. "Linda," I said, turning back to Julian. She was my mother's assistant for years, but before that she worked directly with Beatrice when the firm was still in its infancy. She knows where the original charter is, and she knows how much my father had to manipulate to get his current level of authority. Julian frowned, tapping his pen against the table. "Linda is a corporate veteran. She retired from the assistant role months ago, but she still maintains a consultancy position with the board. However, she has been notoriously silent about her opinions regarding the current leadership." Why would she help us? Because she was the only one who actually respected the vision Beatrice built. I replied, my mind tracing the patterns of our past interactions. My father always treated her like a glorified secretary, even when she was the one solving the technical crises he couldn't grasp. My mother treated her even worse, viewing her as a servant who knew too much. I remember her sitting in the break room on her lunch breaks watching the news, her face reflecting a quiet, simmering resentment that she never allowed to surface in front of my parents. She didn't leave because she was loyal. She left because she was waiting for a chance to see the architecture corrected. Julian looked skeptical, but he began pulling up her file on his screen. "It's a gamble, Madison. If she is still loyal to your mother, she will report our contact to your father immediately, and he will use the information to paint you as a conspirator, trying to destabilize the company." "I know," I said, my voice firm, "but it's a gamble we have to take. If we can get Linda to sign the petition, she represents the institutional memory of the company. The other board members will have to listen to her. She is the only person who can validate that the current management is a departure from Beatrice's original intent." We spent the next 3 hours drafting the specific language of the petition, ensuring that it was framed not as a personal grievance, but as a formal request for an audit based on the original Articles of Incorporation. It was a document designed to trigger an immediate mandatory review, leaving the board with no legal room to maneuver without risking a catastrophic loss of investor confidence. When the document was finally ready, I stood up and straightened my blazer, the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. "I have to go see her myself," I said, grabbing my coat. "No emails, no couriers. This has to be a face-to-face conversation." Julian hesitated, but he knew the logic behind my request. If she sees that I am the one leading this effort, if she sees that I have the evidence and the resolve to finish it, she will understand that the time for silence is over. I drove to the address I had pulled from the company's old directories, a quiet, well-maintained house in the suburbs that felt a world away from the gleaming steel of the downtown headquarters. I sat in my car for several minutes, the engine cooling, watching the porch light of the house. I had no idea what kind of reaction I would get. If she were still loyal, I was walking into a trap. But I had the records, and I had the conviction, and that had to be enough. I stepped onto the porch and rang the bell, the sound echoing in the stillness of the street. After a long moment, the door opened. Linda stood there, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes sharp and suspicious as she looked at me. "Madison?" she said, her voice registering genuine surprise. "You shouldn't be here. Your father's security team has been monitoring the company's contacts." "I know," I said, keeping my voice low. "That is exactly why I came here. I don't want to talk about company politics on a recorded line." She looked at me, a flicker of something passing behind her eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the recognition of the girl who had spent years in the basement office. "Come inside," she finally whispered, opening the door wider. But you have 10 minutes. My father's men are currently reviewing the visitor logs of everyone connected to the firm. We moved into her kitchen, a space that was impeccably clean and filled with books on software design. I didn't waste time. I placed the evidence of the financial discrepancies and the copy of Beatrice's codicil on the table. She looked at the documents, her face remaining mask-like as she processed the information. For a long time, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. She finally looked up, her gaze pinning me to the chair. "You have the evidence," she said, her tone devoid of its usual professional sheen. "But you don't have the support of the majority. Your father has promised them that the growth numbers will stabilize by the end of the quarter." "He is lying," I said, my voice rising slightly. "The growth is being artificially inflated by the offshore accounts. The moment the auditors look at the ledger, the stock will drop. If the board doesn't act now, they will be complicit in the collapse." Linda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And why should I risk my reputation for you?" "Because you know this company was meant to be an innovator, not a piggy bank for his retirement," I replied, meeting her gaze. "Because you were there in the beginning and you saw what Beatrice intended." She looked down at the codicil again, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the wax seal. "I remember the day she finalized the charter," she whispered. She knew he would eventually lose his way. She wanted to ensure that the foundation remained intact, no matter who was in the CEO chair. I reached across the table and placed my hand on the document. "I am not asking you to take a risk for me, Linda. I am asking you to finish the project you started with her. We are talking about the soul of this company." She stared at the papers, the weight of the decision evident in the tight line of her mouth. The silence stretched until it felt like it would shatter. Then she picked up a pen from the counter. "Your father has never understood that this firm was built on the strength of its code, not the size of its ego," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He thinks he can hide the truth behind a wall of lawyers. He is wrong." She signed the petition, the ink dark and permanent against the cream paper. I felt a surge of relief that was almost overwhelming. With her signature, we had a legitimate, experienced voice on our side. It was the crack in the wall we had been looking for. But as I stood up to leave, she caught my arm, her expression turning serious again. "This isn't the end, Madison. Your father has a secondary contingency. He has been liquidating parts of the intellectual property to a shell corporation in Europe. Even if you win the board vote, you will inherit a company with its core assets gutted." I froze. What I hadn't seen anything in the data about an IP liquidation. "It was hidden," Linda explained. "He's been moving the patents through a series of offshore holding companies, none of which appear on the primary balance sheet. He plans to leave you with the shell of the business while he walks away with the real value of the firm." The room seemed to spin. I had focused so intently on the financial fraud that I had missed the most critical piece of his exit strategy. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing the future of the company. The fight had just become exponentially more dangerous. I thanked Linda and hurried out the door, the urgency of the new threat burning in my mind. I had to get back to Julian. We didn't just need to fire my father, we needed to stop the sale of the assets before they disappeared forever. The conflict had just shifted, and the stakes were no longer about who would lead the company, they were about whether there would be a company left to lead at all. I started the car, my mind racing through the possibilities of how to track the intellectual property. He was playing a deeper game than I had anticipated, but he had made one mistake. He had underestimated the person who understood the structure of his deceit. I was the architect, and I was going to find every single piece of that stolen legacy before he could finalize the theft. The boardroom on Monday was going to be the arena, but the real battle was being fought in the dark corners of the firm's digital infrastructure. I had the board support, but I needed the patents, and I was going to get them. The revelation that my father was gutting the company from the inside, systematically liquidating our intellectual property into untraceable European shell entities, felt like a physical blow. I drove away from Linda's house with my pulse racing, the quiet suburban streets now appearing like a staging ground for a much larger, darker deception. He wasn't just managing the firm poorly, he was actively preparing to leave me with a hollowed-out carcass of a business while he retired to a life of untaxed luxury. My focus had been on the boardroom and the votes, but I had been blindsided by a thief who knew exactly how to hide his tracks. I pulled into a rest stop on the outskirts of the city, needing a moment to process the logistics of this new threat. I couldn't just show up to the board meeting with a petition. I needed to freeze the IP transfers immediately. I reached out to Julian, my fingers flying across the glass of my phone, demanding a legal hold on all international patent movements. The clock wasn't just ticking for the meeting, it was accelerating for the entire future of Robinson Tech. The morning of the graduation party, the day that had initially set this entire chain of events into motion, felt like a lifetime ago. It was supposed to be Paige's day of triumph, a day where my parents could parade their perfect daughter before the elite of Seattle and cement her role as the undisputed heir. Instead, it had become the theater where the family's narrative began to unravel. My apartment felt small and stifling, so I headed to a coffee shop near the venue, intending to use the public Wi-Fi to scour the international patent databases. I was halfway through a complex search when the bells above the door jingled and the air in the shop seemed to shift instantly. Paige walked in, her silhouette familiar even from across the room. She was wearing a designer ensemble that looked better suited for a red carpet than a morning latte, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced arrogance of someone who had never been told no. When she spotted me at the corner table, her expression did not soften. She marched over her heels, clicking against the hardwood with a rhythmic, sharp intensity that mirrored her internal state. "So this is where the traitor hides," she said, pulling out a chair without asking, and sitting down with a flourish that drew the attention of every other patron. "You are pathetic, Madison. You really think you can just march into the graduation gala and start throwing around threats about offshore accounts? You look like you bought that blazer at a clearance rack in a discount department store." I didn't look up from my laptop, my eyes scanning a series of patent assignment filings from a shell company in Luxembourg. "I'm sorry, Paige," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, "but I am currently in the middle of tracking down a few $1 million that apparently went missing from the research budget. Do you mind?" Her face flushed with a sudden sharp indignation. "You are such a fraud. You are just bitter because you were never talented enough to keep up with the real work. You were the slow one who couldn't even master basic administrative tasks without 3 times the effort. That is why they never gave you anything. You were lucky to even have a cubicle." I finally closed the laptop, meeting her gaze with a calm that clearly unsettled her. "Is that what they told you, Paige? That I was too slow to understand the business? Or is that what they told you so you wouldn't bother to ask questions about why you were getting the corner office, while I was the one fixing the logistical errors you left behind?" Her posture faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered her entitled energy, surging back to the surface. "You are the one who failed. Not me. I have the pedigree, the education, and the support of every investor who matters. You have a grudge and a cheap outfit. You are trying to ruin the most important day of my life because you can't stand seeing me succeed." I looked at her, seeing for the first time the fragile scaffolding of her own confidence. She was terrified. She knew that if the company failed, her entire identity would vanish along with it. She wasn't just protecting her lifestyle. She was protecting her sense of self, which was entirely dependent on my father's distorted reality. "You are worried about the wrong things, Paige," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You should be worried about where your paycheck is going to come from in 6 months. Dad isn't building a future for you. He is liquidating the assets. He is selling the patents, the core tech, the very thing that makes this company valuable, and he is moving the money into his own private accounts." She scoffed, though the sound lacked its usual bite. "You are lying. You are just trying to make me doubt him, because you are a sad, desperate person." I didn't bother to show her the files. She wouldn't understand the structure of the data, and she didn't want to see the truth. She wanted to believe in the illusion. "I am not trying to make you doubt him," I replied, picking up my drink. I am trying to tell you that you are being used just like I was, but at least I had the sense to look at the books. She stood up, her hand shaking as she reached for her bag. You are going to regret this, Madison. When Dad is finished with you, you will be lucky to find work as a receptionist. He is going to ensure that you never step foot in this industry again. I watched her walk toward the door, her pace hurried and frantic. She was a hurricane of entitlement, convinced that her world was too big to fall, unaware that the foundation had already been compromised. She disappeared into the Seattle morning, and I returned to my laptop. The encounter had left a bitter taste, but it also confirmed my trajectory. They were going to fight me with everything they had, using the tools of character assassination and professional ruin. They were already moving to destroy my reputation before I could even make my case to the board. The message from Julian pinged again. He had found a lead on a high-level manager in the finance department who was terrified of being implicated in the tax evasion charges. If I could flip him, I would have the final confirmation of the Luxembourg transfers. I left the coffee shop and headed toward the downtown docks, a place where the old industrial history of the city met the new tech-focused reality. The meeting was supposed to be discreet, away from the prying eyes of my father's corporate security. I parked the car and walked toward the pier, the wind whipping off the water and chilling me to the bone. The manager, a man named Henderson, was waiting near a cargo container, his face pulled tight with nervous exhaustion. "You don't know what you are doing," he told me as I approached. "If the board finds out I talked to you, my career is over." "I don't care about your career, Henderson," I said, my voice hard. "I care about the patents. I need to know the name of the shell company he is using for the Luxembourg transfers." He hesitated, looking around the deserted pier. He saw my resolve, the way I stood my ground despite the danger, and he realized I was not playing a game. He scribbled a name on a scrap of paper and pressed it into my hand. "It is a holding company called Vesper Assets," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They are moving the transfers under the guise of an international research grant." I grabbed the note, my heart leaping. Vesper Assets. It was a name that had appeared in the margins of a report I had filed months ago. A minor expense that I had flagged as a potential conflict, but that my father had dismissed as an internal tax offset. I had been right all along. I turned to thank Henderson, but he was already moving away, disappearing into the shadows of the containers. I had the name. I had the leverage. But as I turned to head back to the car, I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of gravel behind me. I stopped, a prickle of fear running down my spine. I hadn't been careful enough. My father had not just been watching me, he had been tracking my movements. A large figure emerged from the darkness near the edge of the pier, his silhouette broad and menacing. It wasn't my father, but it was someone who worked for him, a man I had seen accompanying him at previous board events. "You should have stayed in your apartment, Madison," he said, his voice deep and devoid of sympathy. "The boss doesn't like it when you go for walks at night." I didn't wait for him to close the distance. I sprinted toward the car, my heart hammering against my ribs, the adrenaline flooding my veins. This was the moment where the boardroom conflict had officially spilled over into the physical world. I wasn't just fighting with documents anymore. I was fighting for my safety. I reached the vehicle and fumbled with the keys, the man closing the gap with terrifying speed. I threw myself inside the door, slamming shut just as he reached the handle. I locked the doors and started the engine, the tires spinning on the wet gravel as I sped away from the pier, his heavy fist slamming against the window as I made my escape. I drove until the city lights were just aglow in the distance, my hands trembling on the wheel. They were not playing by the rules of the board anymore. They were escalating the conflict, and I had to respond in kind. I needed protection, and I needed it immediately. I pulled into a hotel parking lot, well away from my home or my office, and made a call to the only person I could trust. Julian picked up on the first ring. "I have the name of the holding company," I said, my voice breathless. "And I have been compromised. We need to secure the meeting space, and we need to hire private security for Monday morning." The boardroom was no longer just a room. It was the front line, and I was going to be the one to dictate the terms of the engagement. The storm had fully gathered and the lightning was about to strike. I wouldn't just win the vote, I would expose the entire criminal operation that my father had carefully nurtured. The surprise I had in store for them would ensure that Robinson Tech would be cleaned from the top down, a legacy not of greed, but of the very innovation Beatrice had envisioned. The satisfaction of that outcome was the only thing keeping me going. The end was near, and I was absolutely fully ready. Monday morning arrived with a gray, relentless drizzle that seemed to drape over Seattle like a heavy shroud. I sat in the back of an armored town car, the quiet interior a stark contrast to the turbulence that had defined my life over the past week. Julian sat across from me, his expression uncharacteristically grave, as he reviewed the stack of documents one last time. We were not just walking into a corporate meeting, we were stepping into an arena where my father would undoubtedly play his final most desperate card. I felt a cold, clear focus taking hold of my senses. I had spent years being the daughter who was expected to hover in the periphery, the one who was meant to be grateful for the scraps thrown her way, while the rest of the world ignored her existence. That girl had been stripped away by the fire of the last few days, leaving behind a woman who understood the leverage of truth. The headquarters of Robinson Tech rose before us like a monument to my father's unchecked hubris. Every floor of that building represented a different level of his manipulation, from the basement, where I had been relegated, to the penthouse suites, where he had conducted his secret liquidations. We pulled into the executive bay, the security guards watching us with a mix of confusion and deference. My father had undoubtedly issued orders to block my entry, but he had failed to account for the legal reality of the codicil I carried. When we stepped out of the car, I noticed the heavy presence of private security personnel stationed near the elevators. They were clearly there for me. I didn't hesitate. I marched toward the security desk, Julian trailing slightly behind to handle the inevitable protests. The head of the security team, a man who had known me since I was a teenager, stepped into my path with a hand raised in warning. "Madison, I am sorry, but I have strict instructions from Mr. Robinson. You are not authorized to enter the executive levels." He said, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret that didn't soften his resolve. I stopped, looking him squarely in the eye. "You are an employee of Robinson Tech, not a personal servant of David Robinson," I told him, my voice projecting a calm authority that seemed to take him off balance. "My father is currently in breach of the company's charter. If you block my entry, you are complicit in a civil and criminal violation of the firm's governance. I have the notarized paperwork here that identifies me as the majority shareholder. If you do not let me pass, you will be named in the injunction that is currently being filed with the state attorney's office." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking to the document Julian held up, the heavy seal of the state notary gleaming in the artificial light of the lobby. He knew the risks. He knew that the hierarchy he served was about to undergo a seismic shift, and he didn't want to be on the wrong side of the paperwork. After a tense silence, he stepped aside, the automatic gates clicking open as he gave a slight acknowledging nod. I didn't look back. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a quiet, efficient hiss that signaled the beginning of the end. We ascended to the 42nd floor, the numbers climbing slowly, the tension in the space thick enough to choke on. This was it. The boardroom was just beyond the doors, filled with the people who had spent their lives believing my father's lies and treating me as the family's soft, slow-witted failure. When the elevator doors slid open, I found the lobby of the executive floor unusually quiet. No secretaries were at their desks, no assistants bustling with files. It was as if the entire floor had been cleared, leaving only the boardroom in the center of the silence. I walked down the long, carpeted hall, the sound of my heels clicking against the floor the only noise in the corridor. I reached the double doors and pushed them open. The room was illuminated by the morning light flooding in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, dramatic shadows over the walnut table. My father sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of iron, while my mother sat to his right, her posture rigid. The remaining board members sat in their usual positions, their attention focused on the screen where a presentation about the future of the company was currently being projected. The moment I stepped inside, the entire room went silent. The presentation flickered and died as my father stood up, his face reddening with an indignation that seemed to vibrate in the air. "I told security you were not to be allowed here," he roared, his voice hitting the high-end acoustic panels with a harsh, echoing ring. "This is a private meeting of the board of directors. You are a terminated employee, and you have no standing to address this room." I didn't stop walking until I was at the opposite end of the table directly across from him. "I am not here as an employee, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his volume with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "I am here as the majority shareholder of this firm." My mother let out a shrill, mocking laugh, though her eyes were darting to the boardroom door as if hoping for a security guard to rush in and save her. "Majority shareholder," she echoed, her voice trembling. "You have been reading too many fairy tales, Madison. You don't have a single share of voting power in this company. You are a delusional, bitter girl who is having a public breakdown." I didn't react to her insults. I had expected them. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the notarized codicil that Julian and I had verified. I walked the length of the table, the board members shifting in their seats as they realized I was not going to be intimidated. I placed the document in front of the board chairperson, Arthur Hayes, who stared at the papers as if they were a live grenade. "This is the original will and codicil signed by Madison Robinson," I said, my voice ringing out across the room. "It grants me 51% of the voting power effective immediately upon the activation of the safety valve clause." Arthur Hayes picked up the paper, his hands trembling as he scanned the legal text. He looked up at my father, his face reflecting the sudden, devastating realization that everything he had built was resting on a foundation of shifting sand. "David, this is—" he started, but my father cut him off. "That is a forgery," he shouted, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. "My mother was the one who managed the estate files. She would know if there was another document. We have the proof that Beatrice was not of sound mind when she allegedly signed this." I walked back to the center of the room, feeling the eyes of every board member on me. They weren't looking at me with the pity they used to reserve for the slow girl in the basement. They were looking at me with the calculated interest of business people who had just realized they were on the wrong side of a power vacuum. "I am sorry to disappoint you," I said, turning to look at my father. "But the document was notarized by a team of independent legal professionals who Beatrice had retained specifically to circumvent your influence. You were too busy liquidating our intellectual property to notice that the structure you were building was being dismantled from the top down." The room erupted. My father attempted to grab the documents, but Julian stepped forward, a presence as imposing as a mountain, and shielded me. The board members began to shout, some demanding an explanation, others looking toward the door as if they wanted to flee the scene before the chaos truly broke out. My mother started crying, a performance that felt more grotesque in this boardroom than it ever had in our home. "You are destroying us," she wailed, looking toward the board members for sympathy. "How can you let this happen? You are destroying a family legacy for a girl who has spent her life failing at everything she touched." I didn't let her continue. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the file regarding Vesper Assets, the shell company that Henderson had confirmed was being used for the IP theft. I slid the folder across the table to Arthur Hayes. "If you want to talk about destroying a legacy, I suggest you review the contents of this folder," I said, my tone as cold as winter glass. "These are the details of the offshore transfers that have been bleeding our core technology dry for the past 6 months. You are not looking at a family dispute. You are looking at a criminal conspiracy to gut the firm." The room went absolutely still again, the shouting dying out as if a switch had been flipped. The board members were suddenly very interested in the papers I had presented. They knew the law. They knew that if I was right, they were all potentially liable. My father slumped into his chair, the color draining from his face, his eyes fixed on the folder as if it were a bomb. He knew that if that evidence was verified, his career, his reputation, and his freedom were all at stake. He had played the game with the assumption that I was playing the pawn, but I had been the architect all along. I had calculated every move, mapped every flaw, and waited for the exact moment when the structure would have no choice but to collapse. And that moment had finally arrived. I stood at the end of the table, looking at the man who had dismissed me my entire life, and felt a quiet, powerful sense of vindication. I was the one in control now. The boardroom was my arena, and the reality of the situation was the only thing that mattered. The storm had finally hit, and I was the one standing in the eye of it, completely, undeniably, and finally free. I had survived, and I was about to build something truly worthy of the name Robinson. The silence in the boardroom after I dropped the Vesper Assets folder on the table felt heavier than the vault doors of a bank. Arthur Hayes, the chairman who had spent decades as my father's most reliable ally, slowly reached out to open the file. His hands were not as steady as they had been when he greeted us earlier, and I saw the moment his eyes landed on the first page of the ledger. It was a consolidated summary of the wire transfers I had painstakingly pieced together during those long, lonely nights in the basement office. Back then, while the rest of the company assumed I was just correcting input errors, I was actually tracing the architectural flaws in my father's financial design. I had mapped every diversion of funds, every shell company registration, and every falsified patent filing he had used to gut the firm. My father remained frozen in his chair, his gaze fixed on the table surface as if he were trying to find a way to make the floor open up and swallow him whole. My mother, sensing that the tide had turned irrevocably against them, had stopped her theatrics. She was staring at me now with a newfound terrifying clarity, the realization that the girl she had mocked for being academically unfit had just engineered the most sophisticated takedown in the history of the firm. One by one, the other board members leaned forward. The dismissive attitudes they had held when I walked through those double doors were evaporating, replaced by a visceral, self-preserving panic. They were reading the audit trail, and they were seeing their own signatures on the documents that authorized the research grants that had been diverted to Vesper Assets. I didn't give them a moment to regain their composure. I moved to the front of the room, standing near the projector screen that had previously displayed Page's hollow strategic vision. I brought up the digital projection of the internal data logs. Each entry was a structural beam in the house of cards my father had erected. "Look at the timestamps," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room. These transfers didn't just happen at random intervals. They occurred every time the internal compliance checks were scheduled. They were designed to coincide with the periods when the firm was at its most vulnerable, creating a cycle of decay that only he and a very small circle of subordinates were privy to. I pointed to a specific series of codes that looked like meaningless noise to the average executive. These aren't errors. They are the signature of the offshore account in Luxembourg. I had identified this sequence 3 years ago, and I had monitored it every day since, waiting for the day when the volume of the theft reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed as a minor glitch. The CFO, a man who had always made a point of ignoring my presence in the elevator, cleared his throat and stood up, his face pale. I had no knowledge of these specific shell entities, he claimed, his voice trembling with a desperate attempt at distance. I was told these were standard investments in emerging market research. I looked at him, my expression devoid of judgment, focused entirely on the facts. "The digital trail shows your credentials were used to bypass the secondary verification on each of these transactions," I replied. "If you were unaware, you are either the most incompetent CFO in the history of the industry, or you are a willing participant. Either way, the liability rests on your shoulders as much as his." He sank back into his chair, the color having completely drained from his face. The dominoes were beginning to fall exactly as I had modeled them. My father finally lifted his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and defeat. "You think you have won," he snarled, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You have destroyed everything we built. You think the shareholders are going to thank you for this. You are going to tank the stock price, cause a massive legal scandal, and likely end up in the middle of a federal investigation that will take years to resolve." I didn't flinch. I had anticipated his argument, the same argument he had used to keep his subordinates in line for years. "The company is already tanking because of your leadership," I answered. "The scandal isn't the audit. The scandal is what you have been doing behind the shareholders' backs. By initiating this disclosure now, I am actually protecting the value of the firm. We have an opportunity to report this, voluntarily cooperate with the authorities, and restructure under a new board before the regulators discover it on their own. That is the only path that ensures Robinson Tech survives. The boardroom grew chaotic. Some members were arguing with each other, others were demanding to see the full scope of the financial damage, and a few were already reaching for their phones to call their personal attorneys. It was the absolute total collapse of the order my father had maintained for so long. He stood up clearly, intending to leave, his arrogance momentarily returning as he tried to assert his status. "I am leaving this meeting," he stated. "When I return, I expect the board to have dealt with this internal disruption appropriately." He walked toward the door with an air of practiced dismissiveness, but Arthur Hayes didn't let him pass. "David, sit down," Hayes commanded, his voice surprisingly firm. "You aren't going anywhere until we have voted on the emergency petition presented by the majority shareholder." My father stopped, turning to look at his longtime ally with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. "You are going to side with her?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward me. "You are going to let a girl who was fired for incompetence take the reins of this company based on a pile of data she spent years spying on?" I looked at Hayes, the man who had been my father's shadow for most of my childhood. He was a man who valued his position above almost everything, but he was also a man who understood when a ship was sinking. He looked at the folder, then at me, and finally at the man he had once considered a brother. "David," he said, his voice flat, "I don't care about the family history anymore. I care about the audit. And if what she says is true, we are all looking at prison time if we don't act. Sit down." My father sat. It was the smallest, most pathetic moment of his life, and I watched it with a detached sense of satisfaction. The man who had mocked my intelligence, who had treated me like an inconvenience in my own home, was now sitting at his own table, forced to watch as I presided over the end of his reign. I turned to the board. "The vote for the emergency restructuring," I said. "I propose that we place David Robinson on immediate administrative leave while an independent committee conducts the forensic review. I also move that we suspend Paige's current management status until we can determine if she had any direct involvement in the movement of the assets." The vote was not a debate, it was a formality. My father was isolated, his influence dissolved by the sheer weight of the truth. When the last hand was raised, the result was a landslide. He had been removed from power by the very people he had bought and sold for years. The shift in the room was instant. The board members, previously terrified of my father's temper, were now turning their attention toward me, waiting to see what I would do with the company. But there was one final conflict remaining. Even without the power of the CEO title, my father was still a master of the legal system. As he stood up to leave, he pulled a small device from his pocket and set it on the table. It was a remote uplink to the company's core server. "If you think you can take over," he said, his voice cold and precise, "you should know that I have initiated an automated encryption protocol on the primary research archives. If the company is not under my control by the end of the day, the data will be purged." The room went cold. He had set a digital trap. If we pushed him out, he would destroy the work. I knew he was bluffing about the scope of the purge, but I also knew he was capable of doing it if he felt he had nothing left to lose. He had turned the company's history into a hostage situation. I had planned for the audit, for the legal challenges, and for the internal dissent, but I hadn't prepared for the level of sabotage he was willing to unleash. My father walked toward the door, a final spiteful look on his face. "You think you are the architect, Madison?" he asked. "You are just the one who is going to be blamed for the wreckage." He left the boardroom, leaving behind a silence that felt different than the ones before. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of a desperate realization. We had the board, we had the truth, but we were looking at the potential loss of the company's entire intellectual foundation. The board members turned to me, their faces reflecting the sudden fear that they had traded a bad leader for a catastrophic situation. I looked at the server remote on the table, then at the screen, and finally at the clock. The final conflict wasn't just here, it was ticking, and it was going to require everything I had to solve. I wasn't just managing a company anymore. I was racing against time to save the only thing that had ever mattered to Beatrice. And I knew that to stop him, I was going to have to reach deep into the very systems he thought he had locked away forever. The game had reached its absolute breaking point. The remote on the table sat like a dark ticking clock, a silent threat to the future of the firm I had spent years studying. The encryption protocol my father had activated was not a simple switch. It was a sophisticated piece of code, likely developed by a team he had hired outside the company's internal oversight. Every second that ticked away meant more of our proprietary archives were becoming inaccessible. The board members stared at the device, their faces drained of blood, terrified that the career they had built on the success of Robinson Tech was currently being deleted. I knew the architecture of his threat. I had spent countless hours in the basement analyzing our security protocols, and I recognized the signature of his encryption. It was built on a series of nested loops that required a master key. A key my father clearly believed he was the only one to possess. He thought he was playing the final, ultimate move in a game of checkers, but he had failed to account for the fact that Beatrice had taught me to play chess. I stepped toward the table, my movements measured and calm, and reached for the remote. Julian started to move toward me, his face showing a flicker of alarm, but I held up a hand to stop him. I didn't need a lawyer right now. I needed a developer's mindset. I had analyzed the security logs months ago, searching for the very vulnerability he was currently exploiting. I knew that my father was arrogant, and that arrogance manifested in his reliance on standard high-tier commercial encryption tools. He didn't build his own, he bought them. And because he was impatient, he rarely bothered to update the secondary access layers. I plugged a portable bridge I had brought in my bag directly into the remote's port, bypassing the initial handshake. The screen flashed a red warning, then shifted to a diagnostic prompt. I could hear the board members holding their breath, the silence in the room so profound it felt like the walls were leaning in. This was the intersection of everything I had been fighting for. If I failed, the company would essentially become an empty shell, a victim of his spite. But I remembered the blueprints. I remembered how Beatrice had insisted that every system have a manual override, a safety valve as she called it, embedded in the kernel. My father had bought the encryption, but he had never stripped the company's original architecture, probably because he was too afraid that doing so would crash the entire network. He had left the back door open, thinking it was a structural weakness when in reality it was the emergency exit. I entered the sequence I had discovered years earlier, my fingers steady as I tapped the keys. The red light blinked, hesitated, and then turned a solid, reassuring green. The encryption protocol disengaged, and the data archives began to restore their access protocols across the network. The room erupted in a collective exhale that sounded almost like a prayer. I pulled the bridge from the remote and set it down, my pulse only now beginning to accelerate. My father had left the building likely confident that the destruction was underway, but he had been stopped by the very system he had spent years trying to exploit. I turned to the board, my composure fully intact. "The archives are secure," I announced, my voice clear and authoritative. "The attempted sabotage is now a matter of record, and I suggest we attach it to the ongoing forensic investigation. We have reclaimed our foundation." Arthur Hayes stared at me, his mouth slightly open, before he finally sat down, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the last few hours had finally caught up to him. He looked at me with an expression of profound, uncomfortable respect. "You knew," he said, his voice quiet. "You knew he would try to purge the archives." I looked at him, realizing that the dynamic of the room had shifted fundamentally. I wasn't the girl from the basement anymore. I was the only person in the room who understood the depth of the company's architecture. I didn't answer his question directly. I simply walked to the head of the table and took the chair my father had occupied only minutes earlier. It was a simple act, but it signaled a permanent transfer of power. "Now let's discuss the vote of no confidence," I said, my tone brisk. We need to formalize the restructuring of the executive office. We are not just removing David from his position, we are initiating a total audit of every department he touched. The motion was passed within minutes, the board members eager to distance themselves from his legacy. But I didn't stop there. I knew that simply firing him would create a martyr who could spend years tied up in legal appeals and private sabotage. I needed to keep him under our purview to strip him of his autonomy while ensuring he remained accountable to the board until the full investigation was finished. I proposed that instead of total removal, we transition him to a reporting role where he would be required to answer to the board for every single move he made with his authority, restricted to the point of irrelevance. He would be forced to sit in a cubicle to account for his expenses and to provide daily reports on his status, effectively turning his former palace into his own private prison. The board looked at me, a mixture of awe and fear in their eyes. It was a cruel sentence perhaps, but it was perfectly consistent with the logic of the corporate world. He had tried to strip me of everything. Now he would spend his final days in the industry, watching as I rebuilt everything he had tried to destroy. I watched the votes rise one by one, the room so silent that I could hear the wind beating against the glass. It was done. The man who had defined my life by his dismissal was now a subject of the system he had created. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction, but it was quickly overshadowed by the next conflict that was already beginning to emerge. Before the meeting could adjourn, a courier arrived at the door bearing a set of papers that Julian accepted with a frown. He opened them and read the contents, his face tightening. It was an injunction from a group of European investors who were partners in the Vesper Assets shell company. They were claiming that they held a legal interest in the core patents I had just secured, and they were petitioning the court to stop all operations of the Robinson Tech Research Division until the ownership dispute was settled. My father had been busy. Even after his defeat in the boardroom, he had set a legal trap in the international courts. He knew that even if I took control of the company, I wouldn't be able to innovate produce or sell anything if the patents were locked in litigation. I looked at the papers, the frustration of the situation threatening to overwhelm me. He was still fighting even from the margins. He had ensured that if he couldn't control the legacy, no one could. The board members, who were just beginning to feel safe, started to murmur with anxiety. They were looking at me again, waiting to see if I had an answer to this new assault. I looked at the injunction, then back at the table. "This is a delaying tactic," I said, my voice cutting through their fear. "He is trying to force us into a settlement so he can retain a portion of the assets. He wants us to buy him out of his own crime." The room grew dark as the afternoon rain intensified, the city outside becoming a blur of gray. I stood at the head of the table, realizing that the real battle wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about dismantling the entire international architecture of his deceit. I turned to Julian, who was already preparing to counterfile. "We have the proof that the shell companies were used for illegal transfers," I said. "We need to go public with the proof of the Vesper Assets fraud. If we show the court that these patents were stolen from the company's research budget, the injunction will be thrown out in hours." But I knew there was more to it. My father was desperate, and a desperate man often resorted to more dangerous measures when his legal options vanished. As I gathered my files, I realized that I had to visit him. He was still in the building, likely gathering his things, still believing he could turn this around. I needed to look him in the eye and tell him that it was over, not just to gloat, but to ensure that he understood that the next move he made would be his last. I excused myself from the board and headed toward his office. The corridors now quiet and empty. I was entering the final stage of the conflict, the place where the daughter finally confronted the man who had tried to define her existence. The drama was about to escalate, and the payoff was waiting just behind the office door. I took a deep breath, adjusted my jacket, and prepared to face the man who had tried to destroy me. The silence in the hallway was loud, a precursor to the final truth I had been waiting to deliver for 27 years. The corridor leading to my father's office felt like a gauntlet. The plush carpeting absorbed the sound of my footsteps, yet the air remained thick with the tension of the last few hours. I reached the mahogany doors, the heavy wood carved with the Robinson Tech insignia, a symbol that once represented an insurmountable wall between my father's world and my own. I did not knock. I simply turned the handle and pushed the door open. My father stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette framed against the gray expanse of the Seattle skyline. He was packing a small leather satchel with the same methodical precision he had applied to the destruction of my career. He didn't turn when I entered, but the tension in his shoulders told me he knew exactly who stood behind him. "You are finished," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room. "The board has voted and the legal hold on the IP is currently being filed. You don't have to worry about the company anymore, David. You have successfully removed yourself from the equation." He turned, then his face a mask of bitter exhaustion. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deepened by the sudden rapid collapse of his control. "You think you are the hero of this story," he said, his voice quiet. "You think that by dragging the truth into the light, you have saved the firm. You have only exposed it to the vultures. The moment the press hears about this, the stock price will plummet, and the partnerships I spent decades building will dissolve in a matter of hours." I stepped into the room, my presence now commanding the space in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few days ago. "I am not the hero," I replied. "I am the cleanup crew. You treated this firm like a personal bank account, and now you have to face the consequences of that choice." He laughed, a thin, sharp sound. "And what about your mother? She is currently in the lobby waiting to see if there is any way to salvage her social standing. She has spent her entire life curating an image of perfection, and she is terrified of the moment she has to explain why her husband and daughter are currently locked in a war for the soul of the company." The mention of my mother was the final warning. I knew she would be waiting for me, and I knew she would come armed with the only weapon she had ever known, the performance of maternal concern. I left my father in the silence of his hollowed-out office and headed back toward the elevators. I needed to leave this building to escape the crushing weight of the history that lived in these walls. But as I predicted when I stepped into the lobby, there she was. My mother stood near the security desk, her expression perfectly composed, the picture of a concerned matriarch who had been dragged into a situation beyond her control. "Madison," she said, rushing toward me with her arms outstretched, "I was so worried about you. This whole situation has spiraled so far out of control. We need to talk, just us." She tried to take my hand, a gesture that felt like a violation of the boundaries I had spent years constructing. I pulled back, my expression as cold as the glass doors behind me. "We have nothing to discuss, Susan. The board has made their decision and my legal counsel is handling the rest." Her face fell, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her eyes before she replaced it with the practiced, fragile vulnerability she had used to win over her country club peers for decades. "I know you are angry," she whispered, her voice cracking with a precision that was almost impressive. "I know you think I never supported you, but that wasn't how it was. I was doing what I thought was best for the family. We had a reputation to uphold, a future to secure for Paige. I was trying to hold everything together." I looked at her, seeing the woman who had spent my childhood telling me I was broken. The woman who had watched as my father dismissed my every attempt to contribute, the woman who had valued a clean record over the well-being of her own child. "You were holding everything together for yourself," I countered. "You were never trying to secure a future for the family. You were trying to secure a future for your own vanity. Don't call me sweetheart, and don't pretend that this is a conversation between a mother and a daughter. This is a conversation between a witness and a participant in a fraud." She flinched, the word fraud hitting her harder than any insult I could have thrown. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, intimate tone. "We can make this go away, Madison. If you just step back, if you let us handle the transition, I can make sure you are taken care of. I can make sure you have the life you want, away from all this stress. You have always been the one who wanted to be left alone. Let us handle the board." "I don't want to be left alone," I said, my voice firm and clear. "I want to be the one who decides what happens next, and that does not include you." She stared at me, the facade finally beginning to crumble. She saw that the performance was no longer working, that the girl she had discarded had grown into a woman who could no longer be silenced by the performance of love. "You are going to regret this," she hissed, her voice losing its polished veneer. "You are going to realize that blood is thicker than your little legal games. You are going to be alone, and you are going to realize that when you have no one to rely on, the truth doesn't pay the rent." I turned my back on her, the finality of the movement serving as the boundary I had needed to draw for years. The relationship was over, not because of the company, but because of the fundamental, unbridgeable divide in our characters. She had chosen a life of performance. I had chosen a life of truth. As I walked toward the exit, I felt the familiar sting of the past, but it was fading, replaced by the cool clarity of the present. I had set my terms, and I had survived the attempt to guilt me into silence. But as I stepped out into the Seattle rain, the air felt different. I noticed a car parked across the street, a nondescript vehicle I had seen near my apartment the night before. My father wasn't just working through the board, he was continuing the surveillance. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the rain soaking into my blazer, and realized that the emotional fallout with my mother was only the beginning of a larger conflict. She hadn't just come to reconnect, she had come to gather information. She was reporting back to him, feeding him details on my state of mind, my vulnerabilities, and my intentions. The war had moved to the personal sphere, and it was going to be just as dangerous as the one in the boardroom. I needed to secure my life to ensure that the people who were helping me, Julian, Henderson, Linda, were also protected from my father's reach. I took a deep breath, the cold water refreshing against my skin, and began to walk toward the taxi stand. I had cut the cord, but I could feel the tether pulling at me from the shadows. The next conflict was waiting at my apartment, and I knew it wouldn't be as simple as an apology. It would be an attempt to reclaim the ground I had just taken. I was ready, but I had to be smart. I wasn't just fighting for my future anymore. I was fighting for my freedom, and the Robinsons were not going to give it up without a fight. The fallout was just the beginning of the final act, and I was the one who was going to close the book on their story. The aftermath of my confrontation with Susan left the lobby of the headquarters feeling like a battlefield where the smoke had finally begun to clear. I did not look back as I walked through the sliding glass doors into the biting Seattle afternoon, the chill of the rain a sharp reminder that my old life was effectively incinerated. The board's mandate was official, and the legal machinery I had set in motion was grinding forward with relentless, systematic force. My father was no longer the face of the enterprise, and the era of unchecked vanity had come to an abrupt and ugly halt. I returned to my apartment to find Julian waiting with a secure digital briefing. The forensic accountants had mapped the final movements of the Vesper Assets holdings, and the evidence was more damning than we had initially projected. Not only had he gutted the research budget, but he had leveraged the company's primary patents to guarantee a private loan he had taken out to cover a failing personal investment. It was the kind of reckless, predatory behavior that guaranteed he would never be allowed to hold a corporate office in this country again. I spent the following week navigating the transition. The office environment had undergone a seismic transformation. The corridors that once felt like a labyrinth of fear were now buzzing with the nervous energy of people realizing that the regime of terror had ended. I stepped into the chairperson's office, a corner space that had once belonged to my father, and found it stripped of the ostentatious displays of his ego. I didn't want the mahogany desk or the leather-bound chairs that had defined his rule. I ordered the space cleared, opting for a clean, functional environment that focused on data transparency and the future. My first act was to formalize the Sustainable Tech Initiative, a project Beatrice had pioneered in the late 90s, which had been buried by my father because it lacked the immediate predatory profit margins he demanded. I met with the head of the research division, a brilliant woman named Elena, who had been marginalized for years because she pushed for long-term ecological stability in our software architecture. "We are not just changing the branding," I told her, my voice clear and unwavering. "We are shifting the fundamental mission of this firm. We are going to prioritize the integration of sustainable energy management into our primary software suites. It was the vision Beatrice had championed, a vision that prioritized the integrity of the design over the short-term extraction of wealth. Elena looked at me, her eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. She had been waiting for this permission for a decade. The transition was not easy. The legacy management team fought me at every turn, clinging to the old ways of doing things as if their lives depended on it. I let them go. I replaced the sycophants and the placeholders with people who actually understood the technology, creating a culture of meritocracy where input was valued over social standing. The shift in the company culture rippled out into the market. Our stock price, which had been artificially propped up by my father's manipulations, initially suffered. But as we released our transparent financial reports and clarified the new direction of our research, the narrative began to stabilize. Investors were hungry for structural integrity, and for the first time in 15 years, Robinson Tech was offering them a solid, sustainable foundation. I sold my old cramped apartment and moved into a loft in downtown Seattle, a space with high ceilings and wide windows that looked out over the Puget Sound. It was a home I had built for myself, entirely independent of the Robinsons, a place where I could breathe without the weight of their expectations pressing down on my lungs. For the first time in my life, I found a sense of peace that wasn't defined by the absence of conflict, but by the quiet certainty of my own agency. But the new reality was not without its shadows. One evening, while I was reviewing the final drafts for our new sustainability disclosure, a notification popped up on my private terminal. It was a message from an anonymous source containing a series of documents I had never seen before. They weren't related to the offshore accounts or the Vesper assets fraud. They were related to the initial patent filings from when the company was founded. The documents showed that Beatrice had not been the sole founder. There had been a third partner, a person whose name had been systematically scrubbed from every legal document in the company's history. It was a name I recognized from the early childhood photos I had uncovered in Beatrice's sunroom, a man who had been my father's partner before he was pushed out of the industry entirely. I felt a cold sensation slide down my spine. If this third partner was the true architect of the original patents, then Beatrice's ownership, and by extension, my own majority control, might be subject to a legal challenge that could reach back decades. I opened the file and began to cross-reference the signatures. It was all there, the history of a theft that had occurred before I was even born. My father had not only betrayed me, he had built the entire Robinson empire on a foundation of stolen work. The new conflict was not just a corporate dispute anymore. It was a potential total loss of the legacy. I had moved into a position of power, believing I was finally the captain of the ship, only to realize the ship had been built on a stolen hull. I needed to find this third partner. I needed to know if they were still alive, if they knew what had been taken from them, and if they were planning to come for the company. The peace I had felt in my loft vanished, replaced by the relentless grinding necessity of the investigation. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Julian. I picked it up, my heart rate accelerating. "We have a problem," Julian said, his voice unusually tense. "The court has received an emergency filing from a firm in California. They are claiming an ownership stake in our primary software engine. They are naming Beatrice Robinson in the petition." I gripped the edge of my desk, the reality of the situation dawning on me. My father had been gutting the patents, but he had also left behind a legal booby trap that could undo the entire transition. I looked at the portrait of Beatrice hanging on my office wall. Her eyes seemed to be looking right at the documents on my screen. She had known. She must have known that the origin of the firm was tainted. And now I was the one who had to deal with the fallout of the sins that had been committed before I was even a thought. I sat down at my desk and pulled up the maps I had been constructing, the structural analysis of the company, now taking on a new urgent dimension. I had to solve this, not just to save my own position, but to correct the historical injustice that had defined the family's existence. I wasn't just building a company, I was engaging in an act of forensic history. And I would stop at nothing until I understood exactly how the House of Robinson had been constructed and how to keep it from collapsing under the weight of the past. The final act was not going to be a simple victory. It was going to be a long, arduous journey into the heart of the truth. I opened the first file, the screen illuminating my face in the dark of the office, and began to read. The game had only just begun. The legal threat from the California firm arrived with the precision of a guillotine, but it did not catch me off guard. The revelation that Robinson Tech had been built on a foundation of stolen intellectual property was the final brutal piece of a puzzle I had been assembling in the dark for years. I didn't panic. I didn't retreat to the shadows of the basement office that had defined my early adulthood. Instead, I stood in the center of my loft, the city lights of Seattle glittering below like a map of the obstacles I had already dismantled. I reached out to the primary contact at the California firm, a man named Marcus Thorne, no relation to the estate lawyer who had been the original architect of the software engine. He had been erased from the company's history when my grandfather, Beatrice's brother, forced him out during the initial surge of the tech boom. My father had simply inherited the lie and built an empire on top of it, assuming that no one would ever care enough to investigate the ghosts of our corporate past. I didn't try to fight Marcus Thorne in court. I invited him to the boardroom. I didn't bring lawyers. I brought the original digital logs I had preserved from the basement servers, the ones that showed the exact date of the theft and the subsequent attempts to scrub his name from the registry. I told him that I was the new chairperson and that I was not interested in defending the crimes of my father or my grandfather. I offered him a position as the chief technical fellow, a massive equity stake in the restructured Robinson Tech, and a public apology on behalf of the company. It was a gesture of integrity that the Robinson family had never been capable of making, and it worked because it was the truth. The California firm withdrew their injunction, and the ownership dispute that could have cost me the company instead became the catalyst for its complete moral regeneration. Marcus Thorne was the architect who had built the engine. I was the architect who had secured its future. The fallout from the final settlement made the front pages of every major business publication. My father, stripped of his power and now facing multiple federal investigations regarding the offshore liquidations, had officially vanished from the public eye. Paige had disappeared into the fringes of the social scene, her status and her influence having eroded in tandem with the collapse of my father's reputation. I stood in my office looking out at the city, realizing that the long grinding war for my own existence had finally ended. I had not just reclaimed my inheritance, I had redeemed it. I turned to my computer, the screen soft and inviting, and began to draft the final communication for the audience that had followed my story. I knew that across the country there were other people sitting in rooms that felt too small, waiting for the permission to be who they actually were. I started to type my words flowing with a clarity I hadn't possessed when I was that 16-year-old girl staring at math problems that looked like static. If you have ever been the person the world underestimated, the one labeled as the slow one, or the failure by the people who were supposed to be your foundation, I want you to know that your value is not a variable defined by their perception. I had spent 27 years waiting for my parents to see the structure of my mind, waiting for them to acknowledge the resilience that allowed me to survive their neglect. But the truth I finally understood was that their inability to recognize my worth was never a reflection of my capacity. It was a total failure of their character. I didn't need their approval to be the architect of my own life, and neither do you. Boundaries are not meant to keep people out. They are meant to define where your own strength begins and where the toxicity of others must end. The journey toward my own truth had required me to confront the architecture of my past, to map the cracks in the foundation of my family, and to hold my own ground when the entire structure threatened to collapse. My father had operated on the logic of extraction, taking whatever he could get his hands on until nothing was left but the shell. I had operated on the logic of integrity, ensuring that the work I put into the world was built on a foundation of honesty and sustainable growth. The payoff wasn't the millions of dollars or the position of chairperson. The payoff was the silence in my own mind, the absence of the constant nagging doubt that I had once accepted as a permanent feature of my personality. I was finally undeniably myself, and that was a victory that no amount of corporate intrigue could ever erase. I closed my laptop and stepped out onto the terrace of my loft, the cool night air brushing against my skin with a sensation of total liberation. I had survived the attempt to erase me, and I had built something more enduring than any empire my father had ever imagined. The company was thriving, the sustainability initiative was setting a new industry standard, and the ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. I wasn't just Madison Robinson, the daughter of the disgraced CEO. I was the person who had chosen the path of honesty when it would have been easier to lie. I wasn't the slow one. I was the one who was thorough, the one who saw the load-bearing walls when everyone else was mesmerized by the paint. If you are watching this, if you have recognized your own story in the patterns I have described, I want to leave you with one final thought. The people who fail to see your potential are not the ones who define your future. You are the architect, the creator, and the witness to your own resilience. Your life is not a fixed structure handed down to you by the people who came before. It is a design you are free to change, to update, and to rebuild whenever the old walls no longer serve you. You have the right to claim your own name, your own success, and your own peace. Don't wait for permission to stand in your own light. You already possess the strength to navigate any design, any crisis, and any storm. I stood there for a long time watching the pulse of the city below the lights, forming an intricate network of human experience that was just as complex and just as structural as the technology I managed every day. I was finally in the right place, standing on the firm ground I had cleared for myself. The conflict of my upbringing had been the catalyst that forced me to become the woman I am today, and for that I had no regret. The story of the dumb one had ended, but the story of the architect was just beginning. And as I turned back to the warmth of my home, I knew that I would never again be invisible to anyone, least of all myself. This is my truth, and it is the only one that has ever mattered. Thank you for listening, for following the path of this investigation, and for believing that the truth always has a way of finding its way to the surface. I am ready for whatever comes next, because for the first time, I am the one holding the blueprints to my own future, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The silence of the corner office was never really about the mahogany desk or the view of the Seattle skyline. It was about the weight of being perceived as a static, broken object in a world obsessed with moving parts. For years, I allowed the label, the dumb one, to act as the load-bearing wall of my own self-worth. I accepted that I was the background character in my own family's narrative, the one whose mind functioned with a strange, jagged rhythm that didn't match the smooth, rapid-fire expectations of my father's corporate machine. I spent decades waiting for the people who shared my blood to look at the architecture of my life and see something worth protecting. That was my first and most profound mistake. In American culture, we are taught that meritocracy is the great equalizer, yet we often ignore the fact that the game is frequently rigged by those who write the rules. My father and mother operated on a logic of extraction. They believed that value was something to be seized, hidden, and used to shore up their own fragile public image. They lived by the myth that love is a commodity you earn through accolades and Ivy League credentials. It took me a long time and a great deal of wreckage to realize that their inability to see my potential was never a reflection of my capacity. It was a total failure of their own character. They were so busy curating a legacy of perfection that they lost the ability to distinguish between a person and a prop. The lesson that emerged from the rubble of Robinson tech is one that hits close to home for anyone who has ever felt like an outsider in their own skin. You are the only one who can truly read the blueprints of your life. When the world tries to define you by your perceived limitations, they are often just projecting their own structural fears. My processing style, the very thing they deemed a liability, became the lens through which I saw the cracks in their entire operation. Integrity, I discovered, is a much stronger foundation than status. You do not need the approval of those who have already decided you are invisible. You only need the courage to stop waiting for them to acknowledge your light and start building your own structure. If this journey resonates with you, if you have ever felt diminished by the very people tasked with protecting, you know that you have the right to set your own terms. Your worth is not a variable determined by others. If you want to hear more stories about people who found the courage to reclaim their narratives and walk away from the systems that sought to silence them, please make sure to follow the channel Eldenly Stories. We are building a community here, one story at a time for everyone who is ready to stop being the invisible one. I often think about the portrait of my great-aunt Beatrice that hangs in my home. She knew that the truth would eventually force its way to the surface, and she understood that the most dangerous thing a person can do is accept a life designed by someone else. I have reclaimed my name and my future, but the question remains, what are the load-bearing walls in your own life that you have been afraid to touch? Sometimes we don't realize how much of our own design is actually just a reaction to the expectations of others, until we finally step out of the shadows. The structure of your reality is more fragile than you might think, and perhaps that is the most terrifying and beautiful part of being the architect of your own tomorrow.